Daniel, welcome back.
It's good to be back then.
What are we talking about today?
If Social Security is going to be around during my lifetime, taking early distribution from retirement accounts, and alternative solutions for long term care.
Welcome to the Science of Wealth, where we discuss the science behind financial planning and the art of learning and applying it. Okay, some fun technical questions, some apocalypse questions, and what are we going to do when some warranties start to expire? Good questions for the day. So take us away. What do we want to talk about first?
First, we're going to talk about Social Security. So, I seem to get this comment a lot from two different groups of folks. First group is people my age saying, hey, is Social Security going to be around, when I'm 65 and want to retire? The second group I hear it a lot from is people already taking Social saying, hey, good luck. Social Security isn't going to be around when you retire. Have fun. So, according to the SSA, uh, the combined Social Security Disability Trust Fund is projected to be depleted by 2035. So for someone like me who hasn't taken Social yet and wants to plan for their next couple decades, how do we start to plan? When it comes to retirement, is Social Security going to be around for my generation?
So let's address this in two parts. Let's talk about is it going to be around, and then let's address the how do you plan question. That's at the heart of that. So, as far as whether it's going to be around, Social Security, since even I've been a financial planner and since every financial planner I've known started as a financial planner, has been doing it longer than I have, has always been the subject of it's going to run out of money concern. And it's a fair concern because you pay a ton of taxes into Social Security throughout your career. And obviously, you'd like to get a return on that investment since it's an enforced extraction and not a voluntary donation. I think in that particular element, the concern is valid, and the report that you named is accurate. There is a concern that it could run out by 2035. However, as sort of the saying goes, the observation goes, entitlements are the third rail of politics in the United States. So to say that it would be political suicide for all politicians, doesn't matter whether you're a Democrat, Republican, conservative, liberal, doesn't matter. To let it die or to let it fail or lapse would be absolute political suicide across the country because the largest voting bloc in the United States that consistently votes are seniors. So there's no will to let it die, but is there a will to solve it sooner than later? I think over a decade ago, Paul Ryan was trying to do some stuff to fix it and essentially got thrown out of office for daring to suggest that they adjust the benefits. So it's not a particularly desirable thing to go fix, but it will end up getting fixed. How soon that happens, when that happens, how painful the fix is a question. There have been a number of proposals on how to repair Social Security and make it funded indefinitely or to otherwise ensure that it doesn't run out. But that's sort of a secondary topic.
Okay, great. And, diving into some of those topics a little bit more that might be more secondary, what are some of the potential ways that they've talked about changing it or amending it?
So it really depends on whether your perspective is it should be cut back or whether it should be expanded. So let's talk about some of the cutback options. A couple of cutback options have included increasing the retirement age. So original Social Security retirement age was 65. It got expanded on sort of a step rated basis year over year from 65 up to 67. Pretty soon it's just 67 for everybody. We're still in the last couple of years where a few people are crossing the finish line who get it kind of in their 66 in a few months range. And so there's the idea here is, hey, people are living longer and retirement's lasting longer, so maybe we should push it back to 68, 69, 70. There's been a couple of proposals like that. The question then becomes, how do you draw the line, right? Do you say, hey, everybody under the age of 18, sorry to tell you, but we're going to be step rating it back to 70 over the next, let's say, 30 years? Or do you just, say, hey, sorry, you're under the age of 30, now it's 68, and if you're over the age of 30, it's still 67. So there's a whole bunch of equitability issues that come with that suggestion, but it's a very simple suggestion. Hey, we're just going to push it back because people are living longer, and that will help with the funding basis. The alternatives also include things like reducing cost of living adjustments. You see this in certain pension plans. So, for example, PARA here in Colorado caps the cost of living adjustment for the pension defined benefit plan at no more than either CPI or 1%. So it's either essentially 1% every year because CPI is effectively always over 1%, but it just sort of caps the potential cost of living increases. And there's some support for that. There is a construct in retirement income research called the retirement smile, in which spending is high early in retirement and declines over the course of retirement and only really ramps up towards the very end of retirement, either to pay for long-term care or as sort of bequesting, gifting type things happen. And then alternatively, beyond just sort of that, there are some of the, I'll say, just harsher, more draconian proposals, which essentially just come down to spend less money on old people. I don't think we're ever going to see something like that get applied just because, again, seniors are the largest voting bloc in the United States, and any politician who proposes it is functionally committing career suicide. Then there is the expanding question or the funding question. How do you just give it more money to keep doing what it's already doing? One or two proposals here that essentially boil down to either A, increase the Social Security tax. So currently it's, what is it, 6.45%. Quick correction on myself here. It's actually 6.2%, and I'm about to say the employer and employee side combined is 12.9%, but really it's 12.4%. Anyway, carry on. For a individual, and then their employer matches them at 6.45%. So we're putting in 12.9% overall. Or alternatively, the other version is just to remove the cap. So every year there's a limit to Social Security. Essentially, if you earn above a certain amount, you stop paying into it, and your employer stops paying into it because your benefits are also capped at a certain point. So it's just the funding range of the tax sort of exists to fund a specific level of income or amount of Social Security income. So they stop taxing you above the threshold. And it's been observed that this creates weird phenomena where people who earn much higher levels of income sometimes are paying a lower net effective tax rate than their lower paid employees because Social Security falls off at a certain point. There's also manipulations, things like S Corp profits not paying into payroll taxes and Social Security for small business owners. There's a number of things where essentially the idea here has just been to close some of the loopholes around payroll taxes and to also potentially just uncap payments into Social Security, any of which would probably provide adequate funding to keep it alive indefinitely.
Okay, so stay with me for a second. Imagine that we decide to make no changes. Would Social Security run out?
It's not, bear in mind, the projection from the trustees is not that it will just run out like, hey, we have no more money. It's that we can only pay full benefits through 2035. So let's say we make no changes. If we make no changes, then the trustees are going to have to say, hey, sorry, cost of living increases are cut, or we are reducing benefits to 90% of where they were to sustain. Fundamentally, any social safety net like Social Security is a bit of a Ponzi scheme. It's just one that we all are aware of and voted for fundamentally, or at least our politicians that we elected to office voted for. So at a certain level, if there's still a lot of money coming in from the population, let's just say there's no money in the account, but every single month there's going to be money coming in from payroll taxes that can then just be turned around and paid out to seniors. So there should always be some level of benefit. The question is whether it's enough to maintain the benefits that have already been accrued.
Okay, so when people ask me this question moving forward, it really doesn't sound like it's feasible for any politician to eliminate Social Security in its entirety. However, in our lifetime, we'll likely see some changes and amendments to it before we end up taking it.
Yeah, and how harsh those amendments and changes need to be are really just going to be a reflection of how long it takes us to decide to solve it. So it would be easier to solve it today, but as with most political issues, politicians do not want us to walk through minefields any sooner than possible and would prefer somebody else walked through it before them. So from that standpoint, we will probably be waiting until 2033, 2034, 2035 before anybody tries to do something to solve it. And frankly, they may fail to solve it in such a timely manner that it starts to lapse before they get it fixed, or they fix it at the 11th hour. So all this to say, for the next decade, it's not really a big issue, but it's going to become a big problem in the next decade. Then they will solve it somehow. It's just a question of how they go about it. That's going to be the real debate.
So let's say Social Security is not around, and I need to take an early distribution from a retirement account. that's the next topic here. First and foremost, I do want to to discuss exactly what an early distribution is, because I think that number and that age is different for a lot of people, even though it is well defined per penalties and guidelines.
Well, first of all, if we're setting up a scenario in which Social Security doesn't exist and I have to take early distributions, Social Security not existing actually doesn't really matter to me too much because I'm already so young that I'm not able to claim Social Security. So, it all works out. As far as the distribution guidelines, the common number that gets thrown out there is 59 and a half. When you are 59 and a half, you can take money out of your retirement accounts and not pay an early distribution penalty. We could spend the next hour talking about the exceptions to that rule, but I think in the context of your question, we'll really just talk about a handful here. First is going to be 72T. 72T is a provision that allows the owner of an IRA, specifically a traditional IRA or a IRA rollover, to take distributions out of their IRA as if they were already retired. This comes with a couple of requirements. Number one, you have to take a minimum amount out every year. You can't just pick and choose. Number two, there's a ceiling on how much you are allowed to take out. So you can't just take all your money out and claim that it's early retirement. You have to distribute it over time. And number three, you have to maintain that distribution pattern until you reach that normal retirement age. If you fail to do so, then it all becomes subject to early distribution penalties. So you sort of have to genuinely be retiring and taking the money out. And the idea here between that floor, that minimum distribution, and that ceiling, that maximum distribution every year is just that your distributions are supposed to be substantially equal over that early retirement timeline. But 72T technically allows you to back into a retirement or an early distribution theoretically as early as you want. Obviously, there's people who are not going to be in a situation to need to deal with that. But specifically, if you come into a windfall, you win the lottery when you're 45 or something, then there's a scenario in which you might say, I'm going to retire and I'm going to go ahead and spend this money, and I just need to take out a certain amount every year.
Okay, so 72T sounds like a great way to take that money out pre 59 and a half. However, it does seem to come with a lot of strict rules and guidelines. Are there any other ways we can take that money out pre 59 and a half?
Another version that's out there is what's going to be called quite often the rule of 55. It's not a rule, it's just sort of call it a marketing phrase for it. But under certain ERISA plans, specifically 401k plans and other similar varieties, plan sponsors have the option in their plan documents to allow participants to take distributions without penalties as early as the age of 55, thus the quote unquote rule of 55. I see this one thrown out quite casually, frequently in blogs and in little education things. Hey, did you know about the rule of 55? You can retire at 55 and take your 401k out. All of that is subject to the if your employer's plan permits it. However, this is a really classic example of where financial planners or investment people can have a conflict of interest with their clients, because often a lot of planners' business models won't let them get paid on 401ks. And so they might suggest to a client that they do a rollover when they leave their company or retire early. But remember, right, this really only applies to 401ks and similar types of plans. IRAs have to go through that 72T process. So this is a really good example of a reason to keep money in a 401k. If you've got a employer, whether current or previous, who has that rule of 55 permission established in their plan to let you take distributions out from age 55 and beyond, then that's a really good benefit and potentially a really good reason to keep money in a 401k. I will note, however, that very few 401k providers in the employer marketplace have established a nice, clean, easy way to take periodic distributions from 401ks. For whatever reason, it does seem to be a bit of a headache or a hassle to distribute incremental amounts of money from a 401k rather than big one-time rollovers or lump sums. I think that's just sort of the nature of the business. But for whatever reason, it does seem like it's sometimes on certain platforms difficult to just establish, a monthly paycheck to come out of your 401k.
I think that's a really good point you brought up, and I'm glad you did, about the rollovers. I think for a lot of folks, they might believe that the best route is always to put the money into their IRA if they leave their old employer. However, for some folks, it requires and behooves them to have some discernment around other options, because a situation like this could completely kill the opportunity to use something like the rule of 55 if you were to roll the money into an IRA.
Yeah, and it's just a classic conflict of interest that advisors will frequently tell people to do rollovers from their old employers. There's plenty of very good reasons to move out of old plans. Plenty of plans, frankly, suck. But it's definitely a factor to keep in mind. I know we said on the podcast before that we advised of trying to avoid the breadcrumb trail of old retirement plans going back through your career, simply because it can be harder to get a hold of older plans depending on what they were. But it's just one of the many factors to contemplate there. There are also some special exemptions for 403B and 457 plans and 401k plans for particularly government employees or public service employees. There's some very, very specific carve outs for folks like firefighters, military service members, and so on to potentially take distributions as early as 50 out of certain retirement plans. With that, that's very much a do your homework sort of thing. I would never just flatly say, oh yeah, anybody can do this if they're in this plan and they meet these criteria. But there were some provisions passed in the Secure Act and the Secure Act 2.0 over the past couple of years that provided some more early retirement carve outs for very specific people.
These are very useful opportunities for folks to withdraw money from their 401ks. However, I've also been reading about people taking loans from their 401ks and not having any penalties on the money. Is this true? Can people do this?
Yeah, I mean, people can take loans from their 401k. The trick there is it is a loan. You do have to pay it back. The nice thing there is you're paying it back to yourself with interest. So the whole premise here for loans is more oriented for somebody who says something like, hey, I've got $20,000 in my 401k and I need an extra $5,000, $10,000 to help me close on a house or something. So I'm going to lend myself that money from my 401k to buy a house or pay for my kids' college or whatever the particular circumstances. There are some limits there. Loans are typically capped at either the lesser of $50,000 or half of the plan balance. So if you have $50,000, you could loan yourself maybe $25,000. Again, like the early Rule of 55 distributions, this is a plan-specific provision. Some plans just don't permit for loans. They say, you know what, this is a retirement saving plan. We don't think you should be borrowing this money or using this money for anything but retirement, so we're not going to allow it. But lending yourself money, at least in the United States, is generally speaking a tax-free activity. Now, there are some risks here. If you quit, if you get fired, if you leave the company for whatever reason and you stop repaying the loan, that can end up being accelerated, where effectively you either need to repay it immediately or it's going to be treated as an early distribution subject to penalties if you're below the retirement age for the plan. So it's a tool. It's a good planning tool sometimes, but you do have to be mindful that you're taking on debt and that there's a potentially serious tax penalty lurking behind it if you don't fulfill that debt.
All right. So finally, I want to talk a little bit about long-term care here, Dan. So about 80% of the households that have to deal with long-term care have admitted that they simply can't afford it. And about 70% of people over the age of 65 today will need some sort of long-term care in their lifetime. And it's frankly a pretty expensive expense for such a late period in people's lives. And a lot of people struggle to qualify for long-term care, and it's such a difficult process. So I wanted to talk about it and educate people on all the ins and outs and things they should know. So first and foremost, who can qualify for long-term care?
In terms of long-term care insurance, if we're talking about very traditional long-term care insurance, which would be something like a 3-year benefit for $90,000 a year with a 3% cost of living increase every year, that would be a very traditional structure for a long-term care insurance policy. In that particular example, we are talking about underwriting difficulty, right? Putting in an application and getting approved of something like a 9 out of 10. Where maybe something like a normal life insurance policy might be a 5 out of 10 and getting home and auto insurance might be a 2 out of 10. Long-term care insurance is extremely expensive. It is very difficult to qualify for. A huge variety of things can be disqualifying for long-term care insurance. And the problem is, as you already pointed out, a huge percentage of the population is going to need it. The reason it's difficult to qualify for, the reason it's expensive is because insurance companies, when the marketplace for long-term care really started to emerge in the 70s, 80s, 90s, as these products started to come out, insurance companies were wildly inaccurate with their actuarial analysis on sort of the amount of benefits they would expect to pay out, the longevity of the people going into into care and the premiums they were charging. And so a ton of insurance companies lost money hand over fist. I mean, just absolutely got destroyed in this marketplace over the first couple of decades. And so while we might see some older policies that were written in the 90s where the benefits are essentially as much as it costs forever, and boy, are the people who have those lucky. The fact of the matter is most companies have pulled out of this marketplace, and so it's gotten very restrictive and very difficult to qualify. So let me give you some examples of things I've seen people get disqualified for. I've seen people get disqualified for having things like a knee replacement or hip replacement. I've seen it for people who have, for whatever cause, for many medical things that can cause this, carpal tunnel or arthritis. I've seen people whose parents, even one parent, had a cognitive impairment later on in their life through something like Alzheimer's or dementia get declined. I've seen people who have been medically retired from a high difficulty thing like law enforcement or the military be declined simply because they couldn't do combat anymore, but they were still perfectly physically fit. They just couldn't take that risk for whatever reason anymore, be declined. So the number of reasons you can be declined is almost endless. The irony is most of the things that you'd get declined for life insurance are not a concern for long-term care. So if you've been declined for life insurance because you have diabetes or cancer or heart disease, that is not automatically a disqualifier for traditional long-term care policies, because you have to remember the incentive model here. In life insurance, we're concerned that you're going to die too young, and in long-term care, we're concerned that you're going to live too long. So there's a very inverted marketplace around underwriting. But yeah, long-term care, I would say in the time that I had my long-term care and life insurance licenses and tried to get people long-term care insurance, I think probably only 1 in 4 people actually ever qualified to get it.
Wow, that's pretty tough. So let's say I did get declined. What now?
So, assuming you've been declined for traditional long-term care, you've got a couple of alternative routes here. First and foremost would be either an asset-based policy or a life insurance long-term care hybrid. Some professionals are going to say that I'm sort of mixing my words here, but I'm trying to just define these really separately. So, a asset-based long-term care policy is underneath on a regulatory chassis. It's a life insurance policy, but the deal is something like this. If you give us, let's say, $100,000 when you're 60, we will guarantee a very aggressive crediting rate for that 100,000, something like 7, 8, 9, 10%, something that is investment-wise very hard to sustain in a conservative retirement portfolio. But the idea here is, you give us $100,000 and 20 years from now, right, when you're in your 80s, and you need long-term care, we will have credited something, some ridiculous amount of money. So like $100,000 is turned into $700,000 worth of long-term care coverage. And then if you need long-term care, you've got a $700,000 pool to utilize. And if you cancel your policy, if you die, whatever the case is, then we get to keep your $100,000 and whatever interest we've made on it over all these years. So that's sort of a traditional asset-based policy. Some will come with refund or return of premium structures where, hey, if you cancel at some point, you can get some of it back, but not all of it back. But the basic thing here is you're essentially just going to kind of self-fund earlier on. The alternative then is more of a traditional permanent life insurance policy, whether it's whole life or universal life. But the idea here is you're going to buy what's called a chronic illness rider, which essentially says, hey, if you enter into long-term care, actuarially speaking, you're not long for this world as it is, and we're going to have to pay out those death benefits probably pretty soon anyway. So we will permit you to start distributing a percentage, typically 2% a month of the base death benefit on this policy to help pay for long-term care costs. And in this case, remember what I said earlier, right? Long-term care is like a 9 out of 10 on underwriting. Life insurance is more like a 5 out of 10 on underwriting. So it's a lot easier to qualify for there. You just have to remember that the benefits are much more restrictive, that your costs can be potentially higher in terms of that, and that ultimately your allowance for how much it pays for may be much more constricted than a traditional policy might otherwise be. I think the last thing to contemplate in this particular dynamic then is that probably the number one thing I see, whether it's life insurance or long-term care, is a lot of people wait too long. A lot of people wait until they're in their 60s or 70s to try to start looking at these problems. And the problem there is that the insurance companies are well aware that you are much, much more likely to use that benefit much, much sooner. And so the costs not only are astronomical at that point, but the underwriting is brutal to qualify for because of that. If you're looking at something like solving for long long-term care, I think really getting serious about that in your early 50s is a much better idea before you get to an age where you might have some of those mobility impairments or cognitive impairments start to show up in the traditional space. And in turn, if you've had a clean bill of health, if you haven't had cancer or diabetes or heart disease or something like that, then even if you're declined on the mobility end of things or the cognitive end of things for traditional long-term care, you've still got access to the life insurance marketplace and some of the more kind of hybrid options that are available there.
We speak with a lot of folks who voice concerns for themselves, saying something along the lines of, I think I may need long-term care in my future. However, what if, someone has a parent they're concerned for? What is the recommendation there? How did they plan for their parents' long-term care?
Talk to them immediately. I think this is a very tough conversation because Daniel, you're in your early 20s, right? You don't think of your parents as aged old people just yet; they're just older than you. But the trick here is the timeline for solving this problem is effectively the same for everybody, right? It's ideally somewhere in your late 40s, early 50s. Too many people are waiting until their 60s or 70s, and so as children thinking about our parents, we're often looking at them and going like, yeah, they're not even retired yet. They're still working or whatever the case is. So this is a future problem. When they retire, we'll start thinking about this stuff. But the problem is if your parents haven't saved adequately for this, then the long-term care plan might be you. And I'll say, having talked to many of the parents in this example, as opposed to the children in this example, there are plenty of parents out there who are absolutely planning on calling up their kids one day and saying, hey, I might be out of money or I need help. And I raised you, so now it's your turn to step up. So just keep in mind that even though it may not be part of your personal plan to be concerned about long-term care or not to think about your parents' plan, their plan might be you. And so I think having a conversation about how your parents have planned to pay for long-term care as soon as possible is a pretty good idea, facts and circumstances dependent, simply because, if they have not planned for it, if they're sort of in la-di-da land thinking that it's not going to be a problem for them, you need to be very serious in thinking about how much of a problem it might be for you. I'm not saying you need to run out there and go buy life insurance on them or long-term care insurance on them, but you should get real clear real soon on what your parents' plan is, because whether you like it or not, that plan may fall on you, particularly in states with a filial responsibility law.
Great. Sounds like a plan, Dan. Appreciate it.
All right. Well, then, if you're done asking your questions, you know what I'm going to ask you. What is the most valuable thing you've learned in the past few weeks?
It's funny. I had a feeling you would ask me that question today, Dan. I don't know what it was when I came in today, but for those that don't know, over the last couple of weeks, one of the projects you've had me do is create my own financial plan as if I was one of the clients we were working with. And I think that's been a really great exercise personally, because first and foremost, I get a financial plan created by none other than myself. But I think one of the other really beneficial aspects of this task has been the fact that it puts me in a client's position. And one of the things I've really internalized and learned over the last couple of weeks is what it feels like to be a client. And it's an intimidating feeling to upload all your data and put yourself in a vulnerable position where you have now shared all of your intimate data and information with somebody else. And I think for me personally, it helped allow me to empathize a little bit more with clients and what they might be feeling when they upload information and come into a conversation with us. The number one reason potential clients might not work with us or move forward isn't because they hate us. It's because they're intimidated and they're worried about how they stack up or if they're okay compared to the other people we work with. And I think just empathizing and understanding what they feel like when they go through that has been really important for me in the conversations we have.
The number one question that a client is asking, no matter how they phrase it for us as financial planners, is, am I going to be okay? And, what I can say is I have seen in my practice of financial planner people who are more than okay, and I've seen people who are not going to be okay. Denial is a bad strategy, right? That old expression that, if they don't know, it won't hurt them, does not apply in the world of finance. So I can understand the intimidation factor and the exposure. I've written publicly and pretty extensively about my own finances to sort of try to lead by example that it's just a conversation. It's a loaded emotional conversation, but at the end of the day, to talk about your finances, to get vulnerable and be honest about your situation with a professional is far more valuable than the alternative. So I'd encourage anybody listening to this who's on the fence. You don't have to call us. You can talk to a financial planner. You can talk to a financial counselor. You can even talk, just talk to your parents, like we mentioned earlier, whatever it is. But take the time to get real about your personal finances and be open with the fact that most of us did not go to school for this, and most of us are not really certain about what we're doing. It will make a world of difference if you can really just be open and be honest about your financial position with yourself, with someone else if you need to be. And ultimately, I think it's just going to lead to a much better outcome than sort of burying your head in the sand and just hoping it works out. The Science of Wealth is produced by My Wealth Planners, a registered investment advisor in Colorado. The theme song is This Is Your Time by Dan Phillips. The podcast is intended for educational purposes only and is not investment advice or any other form of advice. Not all material discussed on the podcast is appropriate for every individual in every circumstance, so you should consult with a certified financial planner, tax professional, or legal professional as appropriate before attempting to apply any of the subjects, strategies, or tactics discussed on the podcast.